The Godfather gave the world a version of organized crime built on a code. Loyalty above everything. Family protected at all costs. A boss who operated with discipline, kept his word, and understood that survival meant staying invisible. Millions of people watched it and believed that was how the real thing worked. The actual story of John Gotti dismantles every part of that picture. He removed his own boss in broad daylight on a Manhattan street without authorization from anyone. He spent his years in power actively seeking out cameras, demanding public displays that handed federal agents a complete map of his organization. He spoke on tape about every serious crime he had ever committed, then expected to walk out of courtroom after courtroom untouched. And the man he trusted most, his underboss, his closest ally, the one who sat beside him the night Castellano fell, spent 9 days on a federal witness stand and described everything in complete detail. Today we are covering the real John Gotti story. And the reality was worse than any film ever showed. Section 1. The Origins, from the South Bronx to the Gambino family. John Joseph Gotti was born on October 27, 1940, in the South Bronx, New York. He was the fifth of 13 children. His father was a day laborer whose work was unpredictable at best, and the family never had enough money. The Gottis moved constantly. Too many kids, not enough income, always chasing cheaper rent. By the time John was 12 years old, the family had settled in East New York, Brooklyn, a neighborhood where street gangs were as common as corner stores. That same year, at 12 years old, Gotti started running errands for a man named Carmine Fatico. Fatico ran an underground social club in the neighborhood. What the young Gotti quickly came to understand was that Fatico was not just a local businessman. He was a captain in the Gambino crime family, the largest and most powerful of New York City's 5 organized crime families. Through that connection, Gotti met a man named Aniello Della Croce, who served as the Gambino family's underboss. Della Croce took a liking to Gotti almost immediately, and that relationship would shape the rest of Gotti's life. Gotti attended Franklin K. Lane High School, but dropped out at 16. He was considered a bully and a constant problem. School held no interest for him. What did hold his interest was the gang he had started leading, the Fulton Rockaway Boys, named after an intersection in Brooklyn. The gang was not just kids getting into neighborhood scuffles. They stole cars, robbed people, and fenced stolen goods. 2 of the boys Gotti ran with were Angelo Ruggiero and Wilfred Johnson, both of whom would later become Gambino family members alongside him. Between 1957 and 1961, Gotti was arrested 5 times. The charges were things like street fighting, public intoxication, and car theft. He served little jail time for any of it. He briefly tried to go straight. In 1962, he worked as a presser in a coat factory and as an assistant truck driver. It did not last. By 1966, he had been jailed twice more. The legitimate world never had a real hold on him. His first serious federal arrest came in 1968. Gotti, his brother Gene, and his longtime friend Angelo Ruggiero had been carrying out cargo thefts and truck hijackings near John F. Kennedy International Airport. In February of that year, United Airlines employees identified Gotti as the man who had signed for stolen merchandise. The FBI arrested him. While out on bail, he was arrested a second time, this time for hijacking a load of cigarettes worth $50,000 on the New Jersey Turnpike. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years at Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. When Gotti was released in 1972, he went straight back to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, the crew's headquarters, disguised as a non-profit social club. His old boss, Carmine Fatico, was now facing loan sharking charges and couldn't legally associate with known criminals. so Fatico made Gotti the acting captain of the crew. At 31 years old, Gotti was running the day-to-day operations of a Gambino family crew. His connection to underboss Della Croce was now tighter than ever. Della Croce respected him. The two were similar in temperament, both aggressive, both gamblers, both comfortable with the violent side of the business. In 1973, Gotti carried out his first confirmed act of taking a life. A gangster named James McBratney had been involved in the abduction and killing of Emmanuel Gambino, the nephew of family boss Carlo Gambino. Gotti was assigned to the team that tracked McBratney down. They found him at a bar in Staten Island. The job was supposed to be a quiet abduction, but it became loud and public. McBratney was shot dead in front of witnesses. Gotti was identified, arrested in 1974, and sentenced to 4 years. According to Britannica, while serving that sentence at Greenhaven Correctional Facility, Gotti bribed prison officials and was allowed to leave the facility to meet with associates and even visit his home in Howard Beach, Queens. By the time he was released in July 1977, the Gambino family formally initiated him as a made member and immediately promoted him to full captain of the Bergen crew. He was now officially inside one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. What came next would be decades of escalation. More money, more power, more bodies, and a collision course with the man sitting at the very top of the family. The person sitting at the top was Paul Castellano, and the two men despised each other almost from the start, which sets up everything that would eventually happen on the evening of December 16, 1985, outside a steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. Section 2. The murder that launched him. The Castellano hit. When Carlo Gambino, the longtime boss of the Gambino crime family, passed away from natural causes on October 15, 1976, the question of who would take over was one of the most important decisions the organization had faced in years. The obvious candidate to most people inside the family was Aniello Della Croce, the underboss who had run the street operations for decades and was respected by nearly every soldier and captain. Gambino chose differently. He named Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, as the new boss. Castellano was Gambino's cousin, and in 1932, the two families had become connected when Gambino married Castellano's sister, Catherine. The appointment surprised and upset a significant portion of the family, but with Della Croce in prison for tax evasion at the time, there was no immediate challenge. Castellano was a different kind of boss from the start. He was born in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn in 1915, had an 8th grade education, and had learned the butcher trade from his father. By the time he took over the family, he had made a great deal of money through legitimate-looking businesses, construction, meat distribution, trucking, and he wanted to run the Gambino organization more like a corporation than a street gang. He built a 17-room mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island that was designed to look like the White House in Washington, D.C. It had marble floors, an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and an English garden. Castellano rarely left it. Instead of visiting his capos out in the neighborhoods where they worked, he made them come to him. He would receive them in his home wearing silk dressing gowns and velvet slippers. The soldiers who had spent years grinding out earnings on the street found this insulting. Gotti despised him almost immediately. The new boss lacked what Gotti and the street-level crew valued most: credibility. Castellano had never done hard time, never proven himself in the trenches the way Della Croce had. On top of that, Castellano demanded a larger cut of the earnings from Gotti's crew in Queens, and the two had an ongoing dispute about the share Gotti was allowed to keep from hijacking operations at Kennedy Airport. The resentment was mutual. Castellano was not fond of Gotti either, viewing him as reckless and hard to control. The situation got significantly worse in August 1983. Angelo Ruggiero, one of Gotti's closest associates, and Gene Gotti, John's brother, were arrested for dealing heroin. The arrest was based largely on recordings from a listening device the FBI had planted in Ruggiero's house. Castellano had a strict rule, one inherited from Carlo Gambino, that family members were forbidden from dealing in drugs. The punishment for breaking it was supposed to be death. When Castellano learned about the arrest, he demanded that Ruggiero hand over transcripts of the tapes so he could hear exactly what had been said. Ruggiero refused. He knew that if Castellano heard everything on those tapes, it would tie John Gotti to the drug operation and give the boss the justification he needed to move against both of them. Della Croce, who was Ruggiero's uncle and Gotti's mentor, stepped in and kept the situation from exploding. He promised Castellano the tapes would be provided in time and stalled for as long as he could. But those tapes had already done more damage than anyone in Gotti's crew knew. Based on the recordings from Ruggiero's house, the FBI obtained legal permission to plant listening devices inside Castellano's own mansion. While Castellano was on vacation in Florida, agents entered his home, disabled his security system, and planted devices in the dining and living rooms. Those bugs would eventually produce more than 600 hours of recorded conversations connecting the 5 families to criminal enterprises across multiple industries. In March 1984, Castellano was indicted on federal racketeering charges. In February 1985, he was swept up in the massive Mafia Commission trial alongside the bosses of the other New York families. He was out on bail totaling $5 million across both cases, and he was staring at the possibility of spending the rest of his life in a federal prison. On December 2, 1985, Aniello Della Croce passed away from brain cancer at Mary Immaculate Hospital in Queens. He had been the one person keeping the peace between Castellano and Gotti's faction. With him gone, that buffer disappeared. Castellano chose not to attend Della Croce's wake. His stated reason was that appearing publicly at a known mobster's funeral would not help him while his own legal problems were mounting. For Gotti and everyone loyal to Della Croce, the absence was an unforgivable act of disrespect toward a man they had all loved. Castellano then made 2 more decisions that pushed Gotti over the edge. He named Thomas Bilotti, his personal bodyguard and a man with few allies inside the family, as the new underboss. And according to testimony at Gotti's 1992 trial, Castellano had begun making plans to break up Gotti's crew entirely. When Gotti learned about that, he understood what it likely meant for him. Gotti had already been quietly building a coalition. He had the support of Capo Frank DeCicco, soldier Sammy Gravano, and several others. DeCicco was the one who fed Gotti the information that Castellano and Bilotti would be attending a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street in Midtown Manhattan on the evening of December 16, 1985. Gotti assembled a hit team. The primary shooters, Salvatore Scala, Vincent Artuso, Edward Lino, and John Carneglia, were positioned near the restaurant entrance. A backup team that included Angelo Ruggiero and others waited down the street. Gotti and Gravano parked at the corner of 3rd Avenue and East 46th Street in a car with tinted windows and kept watch with a walkie-talkie. At 5:16 in the evening, Bilotti pulled up in a black Lincoln town car. He and Castellano stepped out. The hit team moved fast. Castellano was struck by 6 rounds. Bilotti, who had rushed out of the driver's side, was also taken down. The entire thing lasted seconds. The shooters walked away into the crowds of Christmas shoppers moving through Midtown. Gotti had his driver make a slow pass by the scene to confirm both men were down. Then they left the area. 2 weeks later, Gotti was named boss of the most powerful organized crime family in the United States. The other New York families were furious. Removing a boss without the approval of the broader mafia governing body was a serious violation of protocol. But none of them moved against him immediately. Gotti now had what he had always wanted. What he did with it would become one of the most watched and most self-destructive, rises to power in the history of American organized crime. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But becoming boss was only the beginning of the story. How Gotti carried himself once he had that power, his obsession with fame, his love of the cameras, and his complete rejection of everything a crime boss was supposed to be, is what set everything in motion that followed. Section 3. The Dapper Don. How Gotti became a celebrity crime boss. Every mob boss before John Gotti operated by the same basic principle: stay invisible. The men who ran the 5 families in New York understood that attention from the press was almost as dangerous as attention from the FBI. They avoided cameras. They declined interviews. When reporters showed up outside courthouses, they kept their heads down and kept walking. It was not just tradition, it was survival. Gotti did the opposite. From the moment he took over the Gambino family in early 1986, he leaned straight into the spotlight. He wore double-breasted suits from Brioni, an Italian designer label that cost around $2,000 per suit in 1980s money. He wore hand-painted silk ties. He got a fresh haircut every single day. When photographers were waiting outside a courthouse or on a street corner in Little Italy, Gotti did not look away. He smiled. He waved. He bantered with reporters. When one journalist asked him whether he disliked being called the Dapper Don, Gotti answered simply, "No, this is my public. They love me." He was not wrong about that part. In Howard Beach, Queens, where Gotti lived with his wife Victoria and their children, he was treated like a local hero. He threw massive 4th of July block parties every year with fireworks and barbecues open to the whole neighborhood. He handed out money. He was generous to people he liked. In a city where crime was extremely high during the 1980s, the neighborhood around Gotti's home had a reputation for being left alone. People who lived there credited him for it. The New York tabloids followed him constantly, and a significant portion of the city's working class found him genuinely entertaining. A sharp-dressed street kid from a poor family who had somehow become untouchable. J. Bruce Mao, the FBI agent who led the squad tasked with bringing Gotti down, and eventually succeeded in 1992, later told the New York Times exactly what made Gotti different from every mob boss before him. He was the first media don. He never tried to hide the fact that he was a superboss. That quote captures the problem precisely. The whole model of organized crime that had allowed the Gambino family to thrive for decades depended on denial. Bosses held no-show jobs on paper. They signed their names as salesmen or contractors. They never admitted to leadership of anything. Gotti announced himself by showing up. The cameras caught him walking into the Ravenite social club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy in Manhattan, his chosen headquarters, surrounded by captains and associates who were now being photographed and identified by FBI surveillance teams stationed in vehicles across the street. Beginning in January 1988, Gotti made a decision that Sammy Gravano, his underboss, considered reckless from the start. He ordered every captain in the Gambino family to come to the Ravenite once a week to check in with him in person. Gravano thought this was unnecessary and dangerous. He was right. The weekly parade of senior Gambino members arriving at and leaving the same address in Manhattan allowed the FBI to build a near-complete map of the family's leadership structure. Every face that walked through that door got photographed. Every name got added to a file. The gatherings Gotti treated as a show of power were, from a law enforcement standpoint, a gift. The FBI had already tried to place a listening device inside the Ravenite itself in 1988. It failed. The club's acoustics were too difficult. An espresso machine running constantly, a rattling soda machine, multiple people talking at once. The FBI moved the device around and tried audio filters. Nothing produced usable recordings. The crew also installed a white noise machine inside the club and bricked over most of the facade and windows in the late 1980s as security measures. Gotti clearly understood he was being watched. He continued holding the weekly meetings anyway. The image he was building had real consequences beyond the FBI surveillance. In 1986, Andy Warhol, arguably the most famous artist in America at the time, was commissioned by Time magazine to illustrate a cover story on organized crime. Warhol painted Gotti. It ran on the cover of the magazine as Gotti stood trial on racketeering charges. A crime boss had crossed over into the kind of cultural visibility normally reserved for movie stars and politicians. The cover made the issue one of the most sought after in the magazine's history. Gotti seemed to enjoy all of it. He reportedly kept a spare suit available at the courthouse to change into after lunch during his trials. He left $100 tips at restaurants. He blew kisses at other diners. When a reporter outside a courthouse once shouted, "Are you a crime boss?" Gotti replied, "I'm a boss of my wife and family." The line got printed everywhere. Former FBI agent Mao later reflected on what drove Gotti toward this behavior. He was obsessed with his own importance. He was convinced that no jury would ever convict him because he was John Gotti, a Caesar, an emperor. That obsession had a direct cost that Gotti either did not fully understand or chose to ignore. Every public appearance gave the FBI something to work with. Every photo made identifications easier. Every time he demanded his captains show up at the Ravenite, he handed federal agents another opportunity. The man who loved the cameras was being watched by cameras constantly, and the footage was being cataloged and used. The fame felt like protection. It was actually the beginning of the end. But it was not only the cameras and the crowds that were closing in. The FBI had already concluded that watching Gotti from the outside was not going to be enough. They needed to get inside the building, inside the meetings, inside the private conversations that never happened in the main room of the Ravenite. What they found when they finally managed it would change everything. Section 4. The Teflon Don. 3 acquittals and the corruption behind them. Between 1986 and 1990, John Gotti stood trial 3 separate times and walked free every single time. The press gave him a nickname for it. They called him the Teflon Don because nothing stuck. At the time, it looked like either extraordinary legal skill or extraordinary luck. It was neither. It was money, threats, and a systematic effort to corrupt every case before it reached a verdict. The first trial began in the fall of 1986. Gotti and several co-defendants faced federal racketeering charges that included loan sharking, illegal gambling, truck hijacking, and murder. The case had been built over years. Before the trial even got properly underway, there was already a serious problem on the witness side. A refrigerator repairman named Romuald Pisik had accused Gotti of assaulting and robbing him during a traffic dispute in 1984. Pisik had previously testified before a grand jury and identified Gotti without hesitation. By February 1986, however, when prosecutors went to prepare him for trial, Pisik told Police Sergeant Anthony Falco that he had no intention of testifying. According to Falco's sworn testimony, Pisik said that because of Gotti's people, he was in fear of his life and his wife's safety. He told Falco he believed his work van's brake lines had been tampered with. He had been receiving late-night phone calls from people who would hang up without speaking. The police offered protection. Pisik refused it. When the assault case came to trial in March 1986, Pisik took the stand and testified that he could no longer identify who had attacked him. The case was thrown out. The New York Post ran a front-page headline that read, "I for Gotti." The federal racketeering trial continued separately and ran for nearly 7 months. During that entire period, something was happening inside the jury room that nobody on the prosecution's side knew about. A juror named George Pape had been seated on the panel. What prosecutors did not know was that Pape had a long-standing friendship with a man named Bosko Radanjic, who led a criminal gang in Manhattan known as the Westies. Shortly after the trial began, Radanjic approached Sammy Gravano, who was not yet Gotti's underboss but was already one of his most trusted associates, and told him that he had a juror who was willing to vote not guilty in exchange for money, and that the juror would also work on influencing other members of the panel to follow. Gravano passed $60,000 to Radanjic to pay Pape. The money was authorized by Gotti. Pape sat through the entire 7-month trial. Throughout it, he met Radanjic for lunch and dinner. During deliberations, Pape announced to the other jurors on the very first day that Gotti was innocent, and that as far as he was concerned, there was nothing left to discuss. He refused to participate meaningfully in deliberations. Several other jurors later told investigators they had begun to fear for their own safety based on how Gotti and his men had looked at them from across the courtroom throughout the trial. On March 13, 1987, the jury acquitted Gotti and all co-defendants on every count: racketeering, loan sharking, illegal gambling, murder, and truck hijacking. The acquittals sent shockwaves through law enforcement and made Gotti a legend on the street. The FBI later determined through surveillance recordings that the trial had been fixed. 5 years after the verdict, in 1992, Pape was indicted for obstruction of justice. At his trial, Gravano, by then a government witness, testified directly against Pape. Pape was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. The second major acquittal came in February 1990. Gotti had been charged with ordering the shooting of John O'Connor, a union official with Local 608 of the Carpenters Union, who was believed to have ordered an act of vandalism against a restaurant connected to the Gambino family. In retaliation, Gotti had arranged for members of the Westies to shoot O'Connor. O'Connor survived, and Gotti was charged with assault and conspiracy. Prosecutors had a recorded conversation in which Gotti had discussed O'Connor and announced his intention to physically harm him. They also had the testimony of a Westies member. On February 9, 1990, Gotti was acquitted on all 6 counts. After the verdict, supporters in his neighborhood set off fireworks. FBI Organized Crime Director Jules Bonavolonta said publicly at the time, "With all this media coverage, he is beginning to look like a folk hero. What the public should realize is that he is the boss of the largest organized crime family, that he surrounds himself with ruthless individuals, and that he is flat out a criminal." It later emerged through FBI recordings that Gotti had discussed plans to fix the jury in the O'Connor case, just as he had in the 1987 federal racketeering case. The FBI and federal prosecutors were aware of this, but chose not to act on it at that point, to the intense frustration of the Manhattan District Attorney and the State Organized Crime Task Force. By 1990, 3 separate prosecutions had failed. The nickname had stuck. Teflon Don was printed on T-shirts. People in his neighborhood loved him. Supporters lined up outside courthouses. The public image was of a man the government simply could not touch. What the public was not seeing was the machinery behind each acquittal. A witness whose brakes had apparently been tampered with before he was supposed to testify. A juror who had been paid $60,000 through a criminal intermediary to guarantee at minimum a hung jury. Repeated FBI recordings capturing conversations about fixing cases. None of the 3 acquittals happened because the evidence was weak. They happened because the evidence never got a fair hearing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The FBI understood this completely. By 1990, they had already shifted their strategy. They were no longer relying on witnesses who could be scared away or jurors who could be reached. They were going after the conversations Gotti was having inside the rooms he thought were private. And over Thanksgiving weekend of 1989, while a widow named Nettie Sorelli was on vacation in Florida, an FBI team had quietly entered an apartment on the third floor above the Ravenite social club and planted a listening device. The recordings they captured in that apartment would make every previous case against Gotti look minor by comparison. The teflon, as the FBI would eventually announce to the world, was gone. Section 5. The Ravenite wiretaps. How Gotti's own arrogance handed the FBI everything. The FBI had been watching John Gotti from the outside for years. They had photographed everyone who walked into the Ravenite. They had cataloged names, faces, ranks, and connections. They had tried and failed to plant an effective listening device inside the main room of the club. The espresso machine, the soda machine, the constant background noise, all of it made the recordings from the main floor nearly useless. Gotti also knew the club was likely being monitored, and his crew had installed a white noise machine inside as a countermeasure. So Gotti moved his most sensitive conversations elsewhere. Informants eventually tipped off the FBI that whenever Gotti had something serious to discuss, he would slip out of the Ravenite through a back door. Sometimes he would stop in the first-floor hallway and talk to captains there. Other times, he would go further, up to an apartment on the third floor of the building, rented by a woman named Nettie Sorelli, the widow of a former Gambino soldier. Agnello della Croce had used that same apartment for private meetings years earlier. Gotti had simply inherited the practice. The FBI surveillance team, led by Gambino's squad head Bruce Mao, realized what was happening. They had gaps in their recordings, stretches of time where Gotti was clearly still inside the building, but no longer audible. Once they understood why, they had their target. Over Thanksgiving weekend of 1989, while Nettie Sorelli was on vacation in Florida, an FBI team entered the building and planted listening devices throughout the apartment. By November 1989, both the hallway and the upstairs apartment were fully wired. What they captured in the weeks and months that followed was not mobsters being careful and vague. It was Gotti being completely direct. On December 12, 1989, in a conversation with consigliere Frank Locascio, Gotti talked openly about 3 separate men whose lives had been taken on his orders. Regarding Robert DiBernardo, a Gambino family soldier, Gotti said on the recording, "When DB got whacked, they told me a story. I was in jail. When I whacked him, I knew why it was being done. I done it anyway. I allowed it to be done anyway." He spoke about Luis Melito the same way, confirming that Gravano had requested permission to have him removed and that Gotti had approved it. Luis de Bono was also discussed. Gotti stated plainly on tape that de Bono was going to be dealt with because he refused to show up when Gotti summoned him to meetings. The FBI recorded that conversation in December 1989. De Bono was found shot dead in a parking structure beneath the World Trade Center on October 4, 1990. The FBI had actually misidentified the name when they first reviewed the recordings and failed to warn de Bono in time. On January 4, 1990, the apartment recordings captured Gotti talking about family operations and personnel in a way that left no room for legal interpretation. On January 17, 1990, he was recorded telling Gravano and Locascio, "This is going to be a Cosa Nostra till I die, be it an hour from now, or be it tonight, or 100 years from now when I'm in jail. It's going to be a Cosa Nostra." These were not the words of a plumbing supply salesman, which was what Gotti still officially listed as his occupation. They were the words of someone who had just confirmed his own identity and role on a federal wiretap. On January 24, 1990, Gotti, Gravano, Locascio, and another man were recorded in the apartment discussing a planned action against a man named Gaetano Vastala, a member of the De Cavalcante crime family. Gotti was concerned Vastala might become a government witness and was discussing what to do about it. That conversation alone, according to a federal judge who later reviewed the transcripts, would have been sufficient on its own to establish conspiracy charges. Gravano later testified that the group had occasionally tried to hold sensitive discussions outdoors to avoid potential listening devices. But as he put it, they could not always go outside. Sometimes the weather did not allow it, and sometimes they were simply too tired. A cold New York winter was part of what kept the conversations inside and therefore within range of the FBI's equipment. On January 17, 1990, someone inside the family tipped Gotti off that investigators had become aware of the monitoring activity. Conversations in the apartment dropped off sharply after that date. But by then, the recordings covered multiple confirmed orders to take lives, direct discussion of Gambino family operations, Gotti explicitly calling himself boss, and a conspiracy to act against a member of another crime family. The FBI had more than enough. On December 11, 1990, FBI agents and NYPD detectives raided the Ravenite social club. Gotti, Gravano, and consigliere Frank Locascio were all arrested inside. When agents came through the door, Gotti was in the back room preparing to drink a cup of espresso. He told them he was not going anywhere until he finished it. Agent Bruce Mao, watching from outside with binoculars, called FBI New York Director Jim Fox on a payphone to confirm the arrests were complete. Thomas Gambino, who ran the family's interests in the garment district, was arrested separately. The indictment that followed charged Gotti with 5 separate acts of taking lives: Paul Castellano, Thomas Bilotti, Robert Di Bernardo, Liborio Milito, and Louis Di Bono. He was also charged with conspiracy to take the life of Gaetano Vastala, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, bribery, and tax evasion. When the tapes were played at the pre-trial bail hearing, the judge denied bail to all 3 defendants immediately. It was the first time Gotti had been held without bail. His longtime attorneys, Bruce Cutler and Gerald Shargel, were disqualified from defending him. Prosecutors successfully argued they were essentially part of the evidence. They had been so deeply embedded in the Gambino family's legal operations that calling them as witnesses was a genuine possibility. Gotti had to find new legal representation for the most important fight of his life. He still believed he could win. He had beaten every case before. He was John Gotti. He had said so himself, on tape. What he had not considered carefully enough was what would happen when the man sitting closest to him for years, the same man who had sat beside him in the car outside Sparks Steakhouse on December 16, 1985, heard those same tapes and reached a very different conclusion about the future. Section 6. Sammy the Bull, the most dangerous friendship in Mafia history. Salvatore Gravano was born on March 12, 1945, in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York. He was not a large man. He stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, but he built a reputation for being exceptionally dangerous in a physical confrontation, which is where the nickname Sammy the Bull came from. He dropped out of school early, later found to have undiagnosed dyslexia, took up boxing as a teenager, and eventually found his way into the world of organized crime through the streets of Brooklyn, where the Gambino family had deep roots. By the time he crossed paths with John Gotti in a meaningful way, Gravano had already spent years establishing himself inside the family. He ran illegal gambling, loan sharking operations, and had built a legitimate-looking construction business on Staten Island that generated millions. He was skilled at the operational side of organized crime, the day-to-day management, the business arrangements, the enforcement. When Gotti needed someone to help organize the Castellano removal in 1985, Gravano was part of the inner circle that made it happen. He sat in the car beside Gotti on the evening of December 16, 1985, and watched the whole thing go down from behind tinted windows on East 46th Street. After that night, their connection only deepened. Gotti elevated Gravano to captain first, then to consigliere in 1987, and then to underboss in 1988. By the time the FBI arrested them both at the Ravenite on December 11, 1990, Gravano was the second most powerful person in the most powerful organized crime family in the United States. He and Gotti were as close as two men in that world ever got. What nobody outside the case fully understood until later was how much of the actual criminal work Gravano had been doing while Gotti was busy being famous. Gravano supervised planned removals of people. He ran the construction rackets. He handled business disputes that needed physical resolution. Former FBI handler George Gabriel, who worked directly with Gravano after he flipped, later said that Gravano helped him take down not just Gotti, but bosses and underbosses from multiple other families, and that Gravano arguably contributed to the collapse of organized crime in New York more broadly. The relationship between the two men started to fracture while they were in custody after the December 1990 arrests. And it fractured because of something Gotti did, or more precisely, because of something Gotti had been saying on the tapes when he did not know he was being recorded. At the pre-trial hearings, portions of the Ravenite apartment recordings were played for the court. Gravano, sitting in the room, heard for the first time what his boss had actually been saying about him in those private conversations. On the December 12, 1989 recording, Gotti told consigliere Frank Locascio that the removals of Robert DiBernardo and Louis Melito had essentially been driven by Gravano, that Gravano was the one who wanted these men gone, and that Gotti had simply gone along with it. He described Gravano in terms that painted him as a man who kept pushing for actions against business partners so he could take over their money. Gotti said on tape that every time they had a partner who disagreed with them, Gravano wanted to take care of it. And Gotti claimed he had just been approving requests. What made this so damaging was that Gravano knew what the truth was. DiBernardo had been targeted based on reports, which Gravano believed were manipulated by Angelo Ruggiero, who owed DiBernardo money, that DiBernardo was making negative comments about Gotti's leadership. Gravano had actually tried to delay that action until he could speak with Gotti directly. And Melito's situation had been approved by Gotti based on the same kind of internal complaint. On the tapes, Gotti was rewriting those events to make Gravano look like the one responsible. Gravano also heard Gotti tell Locascio on the recordings, "Poor John Gotti. He lost control of this monster, Sammy the Bull." When Gotti later tried to explain this to Gravano face-to-face, Gravano confronted him directly. According to Gravano's own account from the 1997 book Underboss, Gotti told him plainly that the tapes were terrible, that they made Gravano look like a monster, and that the legal strategy would involve the lawyers presenting Gravano as the driving force behind multiple acts of violence, so that Gotti could appear to have been a boss who had lost control of a dangerous subordinate. Gotti told Gravano he would have to carry the weight in court. Gravano's response, as he told it, was that this violated every rule of the life they had both sworn to live by. As underboss, he should have been given the right to confront whoever had accused him, prove the accusation false, and deal with it accordingly. Gotti had denied him that by privately laying the groundwork to use him as a shield in the courtroom. Gravano also recognized something practical. Gerald Shargell, the attorney he trusted and had wanted to represent him, had been disqualified by prosecutors who argued the lawyers were too embedded in the family to serve as independent counsel. Without Shargell, Gravano faced the full weight of the case with a legal team he did not choose, in a situation where his own boss was already positioning him to be the fall man. In October 1991, Gravano made contact with the government. He used his wife Deborah as the intermediary, itself a break with every protocol of the life, since wives were supposed to have absolutely no involvement in legal matters. Lead prosecutor John Gleason, who received the message, later wrote that when he was told the underboss of the Gambino family wanted to cooperate, his immediate reaction was that it was the one outcome nobody had even considered a possibility. The FBI worried briefly that Gravano might be a double agent. He was not. On November 13, 1991, Salvatore Gravano formally agreed to testify as a government witness. At the time, he was the highest-ranking member of any New York crime family to have ever crossed that line. He confessed to involvement in 19 acts of taking lives as part of his cooperation agreement. In exchange, he received a sentence of 5 years, and because he had already served approximately 4 years in custody awaiting trial, that meant he was effectively released within less than 1 year of sentencing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What he did on the stand in the spring of 1992 and what it meant for John Gotti is the story of a trial that New York had not seen anything like before. Section 7. The Trial and Conviction. The Teflon finally sticks. The trial of United States versus John Gotti and Frank Locascio began in the federal courthouse in Brooklyn on January 21, 1992. Everything about it was different from Gotti's previous court appearances. The jury was anonymous. Jurors were identified only by number, not by name. And for the first time in the history of Brooklyn federal cases, they were fully sequestered throughout the proceedings, kept in an undisclosed hotel, and isolated from any outside contact. The judge overseeing the case, Leo Glasser, had made these decisions specifically because of Gotti's documented history of jury corruption. There would be no repeat of George Pape. There would be no more $60,000 payments passed through intermediaries. This time, the government had made it structurally impossible for the Gambino family to get to the panel. Bruce Cutler, the attorney who had argued Gotti's way to 3 acquittals, was not present. He had been disqualified by Judge Glasser before the trial began. The tapes from the Ravenite contained recordings of Cutler's involvement in family business that prosecutors argued made him effectively part of the criminal evidence. Cutler could not represent Gotti without potentially being called as a witness against him. Gotti's new attorney was Albert Krieger, a Miami-based lawyer. Locascio was represented by Anthony Cardinale. Both were experienced, but neither had the personal relationship with Gotti that Cutler had built over years. Prosecutors Andrew Maloney and John Gleason opened on February 12th by playing recordings from the Ravenite apartment directly for the jury. Gotti's voice filled the courtroom. He talked about the family's operations. He acknowledged involvement in carrying out orders against multiple people. He described Castellano and explained the conflict that had built to the events of December 1985. He referred to himself as boss in unambiguous terms. The prosecution's strategy was exactly what Maloney had told the jury it would be. Let the defendants speak for themselves. On March 2nd, Gravano took the stand. He testified for 9 days. He identified Gotti as the head of the Gambino family, himself as underboss, and Locascio as consigliere. He described the planning and execution of the Castellano action in December 1985, confirming that he and Gotti had watched from a parked car and then driven past the scene to confirm both men were down. He described the internal order and hierarchy of the family, the way business was conducted, and the various actions he had personally carried out or organized under Gotti's direction. He admitted to involvement in 19 acts of taking lives and testified that 10 of them had been authorized by Gotti. The defense attacked Gravano on every front available. Krieger characterized him as a man willing to say anything to save himself. He highlighted the fact that Gravano had admitted to 19 acts of taking lives and was going to receive a sentence of only 5 years. Defense attorneys pointed out that Gravano had himself benefited materially from many of the internal conflicts he had supposedly reported to Gotti. The cross-examination of Gravano ran for 6 days. At the end of it, the lawyers had not shaken his core account. Gotti's behavior in the courtroom during this period told its own story. He had entered January's proceedings with his usual composed, tailored confidence. As the trial progressed, and it became clear that the 5 witnesses his defense had intended to call were being ruled inadmissible one by one, leaving only a tax attorney to testify, that composure cracked. He began openly arguing with Judge Glasser. At one point, Glasser threatened to remove him from the courtroom entirely. He called Gravano a drug user in outbursts that his attorneys struggled to contain. The man who had smiled and waved at cameras through 3 previous acquittals was visibly unraveling. The prosecution rested on March 24th. The defense presented one witness, Gotti's tax attorney, who testified about the legitimate privilege of not filing returns while under indictment. The closing arguments were sharp. Defense attorney Krieger told the jury the government had manufactured a case from Gravano's lies. Prosecutor Gleason responded directly. These defendants ranted and raved about Salvatore Gravano because he is their nightmare. The jury began deliberating on the morning of April 1st, 1992. After 13 hours, on April 2nd, they returned their verdict. Gotti was found guilty on all 13 counts. Locascio was found guilty on all but one gambling count. James Fox, the FBI's assistant director in charge of the New York office, stood in front of cameras and delivered one of the most quoted lines in the history of federal law enforcement. "The teflon is gone. The dawn is covered with Velcro, and all the charges stuck." When the verdict was announced inside the courtroom, Gotti raised his finger to his lips, signaling to the people in the spectator seats to stay quiet. Outside on the street, however, things were anything but quiet. Nearly 1,000 supporters, many of whom had arrived on chartered buses from New Jersey, Queens, and the Bronx, stormed the courthouse steps. They chanted, "Free John Gotti." They smashed windows on cars parked outside. They overturned a vehicle belonging to the federal marshal's office. Police in riot gear pushed them back. 7 demonstrators were arrested. 8 officers were injured. The scene outside a Brooklyn federal courthouse looked nothing like the orderly conclusion to a legal proceeding. It looked like what it was: the end of an era for a significant portion of the people who had built their lives around the Gotti mythology. The sentencing took place on June 23, 1992. It lasted 5 minutes. Judge Glasser asked Gotti if he wished to say anything. Gotti shook his head no. Glasser told him that the federal sentencing guidelines required him to commit Gotti to the custody of the Attorney General for the duration of his life. Locascio told the court his only offense was being a good friend to Gotti. Both men were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and each was fined $250,000. Within 24 hours, Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, one of the highest security federal prisons in the country. He was issued military surplus khaki clothing and would be allowed out of his cell for 1 hour per day. His tailored suits from Brioni were gone. The public image of the untouchable boss, the dapper Don, the Teflon Don, all of it dissolved inside a cell in Marion. What remained was a man who had destroyed the organization he claimed to lead, and who would spend the rest of his life separated from it by walls and wire. The conviction was not the end of the story for everyone involved. Gravano walked out of prison in less than a year, and what he did next proved that the Mafia's instinct for self-destruction was not limited to John Gotti. Section 8. The Aftermath. What Gotti Left Behind. The morning after he was sentenced, John Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois. Marion was not a standard federal prison. It had been built to replace Alcatraz and had gone on permanent lockdown in 1983 after 2 correctional officers were killed inside. Gotti spent the majority of his sentence confined to a cell 6 feet by 8 feet. He was allowed outside that cell for 1 hour per day. He had the right to 5 visits per month and a maximum of 3 phone calls per month under the terms of his confinement. The Brioni suits and hand-painted silk ties were replaced with military surplus khaki. The man who had walked through courthouses waving at cameras spent his days in near total isolation. His final appeal was rejected by the United States Supreme Court in 1994. Every legal avenue for getting out of Marion had closed. From inside that cell, Gotti tried to maintain his position as boss of the Gambino family. The rules of organized crime, as he understood them, held that a boss could only be removed by death or voluntary retirement, not by imprisonment. He relayed orders through his son, John Gotti Jr., whom he named acting boss, and through his brother, Peter Gotti. A New York Times investigation published in 1996 noted that Gotti had become so isolated at Marion that, unlike mob bosses of previous generations, who had generally been able to move around prisons freely and communicate at will, Gotti had almost no direct access to the organization he claimed to still lead. Former New York State Organized Crime Task Force Director Ronald Goldstock told a reporter at the time that, before Gotti, high-level organized crime figures could practically run the prisons they were in. Gotti's conditions were different, by design. In July 1996, a fellow inmate named Walter Johnson physically confronted Gotti in the prison recreation room, leaving him with bruises and lacerations. According to the New York Daily News, the altercation was sparked by Gotti using a racial slur against Johnson. Gotti's response to being physically challenged inside a prison was to reach out to members of the Aryan Brotherhood, a criminal gang operating within the federal prison system, and offer a payment somewhere between $40,000 and $400,000 to have Johnson harmed. The plot did not succeed. Prison guards determined Johnson was at risk and transferred him to a different facility. In 1998, Gotti was diagnosed with throat cancer at Marion. He was transferred to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, where a surgeon removed the cancerous tumor. For a period, it appeared the treatment had worked. It had not. The cancer returned, and Gotti was sent back to Springfield, where he spent the remainder of his time. His physical decline was severe. A photograph taken around 2001 showed a man who was nearly unrecognizable. He was 60 years old, but appeared decades older. Gravano, who was shown the photo, later said he had no idea it was Gotti. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. The Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn refused to permit a funeral mass, citing his life and the nature of his passing while incarcerated on murder convictions. A memorial service was held at a funeral home in Queens. 22 black limousines, 19 flower cars, and hundreds of private vehicles were part of the procession. The route passed through Ozone Park and Howard Beach, the neighborhoods where Gotti had been a local fixture for decades. Crowds of people lined the streets to watch. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, beside his son Frank, who had been killed in the 1980 accident. The other New York crime families sent no representatives to the funeral, a deliberate and public statement of disapproval for the damage Gotti had done to organized crime as an institution. As for Gravano, his own story after walking out of federal custody in 1994 followed a path that could not have been scripted more cruelly. He entered the Federal Witness Protection Program in Colorado, left it after 8 months in 1995, and moved to Arizona under the alias Jimmy Moran. He later dropped the alias entirely, hired a publicist, cooperated with author Peter Moss on a 1997 book about his life called Underboss, and gave a nationally televised interview to journalist Diane Sawyer in which he called himself a hero. Families of the 19 people he had admitted involvement in taking the lives of filed a $25 million lawsuit against him after the book was published. They lost. Then, in February 2000, Gravano was arrested in Arizona, along with his wife Deborah, his daughter Karen, and his son Gerard. Authorities had dismantled what prosecutors described as the largest drug trafficking network in the history of Arizona, an operation moving somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 pills per week, at prices between $20 and $25 each, generating approximately $500,000 per week. The network had been built through Gravano's involvement with a ring originally run by a man named Michael Papa. Federal prosecutors said Gravano had functioned as a financial backer and organizer. He was identified by informants within his own operation, brought down in a direct echo of how he had brought down Gotti, by people who had once worked with him and then told the government everything. Gravano pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges in both Arizona and New York in 2001. On September 7, 2002, he was sentenced in New York to 20 years in federal prison. The following month, he was sentenced in Arizona to 19 years on state charges, to be served concurrently with the federal term. He was released in September 2017, having served approximately 17 years. He is on federal parole for the rest of his life. The Gambino family, which had been described at the time of Gotti's rise as the most powerful organized crime organization in the United States, with 23 active crews, roughly 300 made members, more than 2,000 associates, and an estimated annual income of $500 million, was in collapse by the early 2000s. John Gotti Jr. had taken over as acting boss after his father's conviction, but pleaded guilty to racketeering in 1999 and was sentenced to 6.5 years in federal prison. Half of the family's made members were behind bars. The organization that Gotti had seized by having Paul Castellano shot on a Manhattan sidewalk in December 1985 had been taken apart piece by piece, largely as a consequence of the attention his behavior had brought down on it. Anthony Casso, the former underboss of the Lucchese crime family, put it plainly when asked about Gotti's legacy. What John Gotti did was the beginning of the end of Cosa Nostra. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final two sections of this story look at the personal cost Gotti's choices inflicted on his own family, and then at the larger question of what his rise and fall actually revealed about the real nature of organized crime, which bore almost no resemblance to the mythology he helped create. Section 9. The Death of Frank Gotti and the Disappearance of John Favara. The story of what John Gotti's life choices did to his own family runs through almost every chapter of his biography, but there is one moment that stands apart from all the violence and legal proceedings. It happened in broad daylight on March 18, 1980, in the neighborhood of Howard Beach, Queens, and it had nothing to do with organized crime. It was just a 12-year-old boy on a borrowed minibike. Frank Gotti was the fourth of John and Victoria's 5 children. By every account from the people who knew the family, he was a normal kid, good at school, loved sports, and known in the neighborhood as easy to get along with. On that March afternoon, he borrowed a motorized minibike from a friend named Kevin McMahon and took it out into the street. A neighbor named John Favara was driving home from his job at a furniture factory when Frank rode out in front of his car from behind a dumpster that blocked Favara's sightline. Frank was struck and dragged approximately 200 feet before neighbors banging on the windows and climbing on the hood of the car finally got Favara to stop. Frank Gotti did not survive. Police determined the accident was not a criminal matter. Favara had been momentarily blinded by the sun. No charges were filed. John Gotti was in the process of consolidating his position inside the Gambino family when Frank died. Victoria Gotti, the children's mother, later attacked Favara with a metal baseball bat when he came to the house to apologize. The threat to Favara's life and safety escalated over the following months. His car was spray-painted with the word "murderer." Anonymous threatening calls came to his home late at night and early in the morning. Someone placed a photo of Frank Gotti in his mailbox. Favara put his house on the market and made arrangements to move his family out of Howard Beach. He was weeks away from completing the sale. On July 28, 1980, 4 months after Frank's death, John Favara left his job at a furniture warehouse on Long Island and never arrived home. According to the FBI, witnesses saw him being struck and forced into a van near his workplace. John Gotti and his family were on vacation in Florida at the time. When detectives questioned Gotti about Favara's disappearance, Gotti said he was not sorry the man was missing and would not be sorry if he turned up dead. Favara was declared legally dead in 1983. His body was never found. In 2009, federal court papers filed in the prosecution of Gambino hitman Charles Carneglia alleged that Carneglia had told a cooperating witness that Favara had been shot on Gotti's orders and his body dissolved in a barrel of acid that Carneglia maintained in his possession. Carneglia was known among associates for this method of disposal, which he reportedly described as the most reliable way to avoid detection. What this episode reveals is something the courtrooms and the Teflon Don nickname could never show. Behind the famous suits and the celebrity acquittals, there was a man who watched his 12-year-old son die because of a street accident, and then apparently had the neighbor who accidentally caused it removed from the world entirely. Frank Gotti's siblings each named one of their own sons Frank in his memory as they started their own families. The impact of John Gotti's choices on his surviving children was permanent and direct. Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti, his wife, had largely raised the 5 children on her own because her husband spent years at a time in prison or in court. She later told the Daily News that she mostly raised her children alone, and that the experience felt like a recurring abandonment. When their son, John Jr., was arrested on racketeering charges in 1998, Victoria DiGiorgio found out for the first time that her son had been inducted into the Gambino family, something she had not known. She was furious. According to her daughter, Victoria Gotti, she went to visit John Gotti in prison and told him she would never speak to him again and would leave him permanently if he did not allow John Jr. to walk away from the organization. Gotti relented. John Jr. pleaded guilty to 4 racketeering counts on April 5, 1999, against his father's advice. He was sentenced on September 4, 1999, to 6 years and 5 months in federal prison and fined $1 million. He was released in 2006 and has since maintained that he left criminal life behind entirely. Peter Gotti, John's brother, took over as acting boss after John Jr. went to prison and was formally recognized by federal law enforcement as the family's boss from 1999 until his own arrest. In March 2003, Peter was convicted of extortion, money laundering, and racketeering related to control over the Brooklyn and Staten Island waterfronts, and of attempting to extort actor Steven Seagal. He was sentenced in April 2004 to 9 years and 4 months in prison. In a separate 2005 trial, he was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy to harm Sammy Gravano, who had remained a target of the family long after his testimony. That conviction added 25 years to his sentence. Peter Gotti died at a federal medical facility in Butner, North Carolina, on February 25, 2021, while still incarcerated. The Gotti name, which John Gotti had turned into something famous, became a name that followed every member of the family into courtrooms, headlines, and consequences they had not chosen. The woman who raised the children told a reporter that she would rather have dealt with a faithless husband than the life that the organization took from her family. What Gotti built, the structure that cost him everything and sent him to die alone in a Missouri prison hospital, also cost the people around him who had nothing to do with any of it. The final section of this story examines what the whole arc of Gotti's rise and fall actually revealed about the mythology of organized crime, and why the real thing looked nothing like The Godfather. Section 10. The real story was worse than The Godfather. The Godfather came out in 1972. It presented organized crime as a world governed by a strict internal code, loyalty above everything, family protected at all costs, a boss who wielded power with restraint and strategic intelligence. The film was so persuasive that even people inside organized crime embraced it. Sammy Gravano said the first time he saw it, he looked up to the men on screen even more than he already did. Real mob figures played extras in the wedding scene. The words Mafia and Cosa Nostra were removed from the script at the request of a real crime family boss as a condition of letting production proceed. The mythology stuck for decades. And then John Gotti came along and systematically proved, through his own choices, that the reality had almost nothing in common with the fiction. The Godfather's Don Corleone is disciplined, cautious, and invisible. He avoids conflict where possible. He protects his family from the business. He understands that survival depends on staying out of the light. Gotti was the exact opposite of all of that. He sought out cameras. He demanded his captains appear at his headquarters every single week, providing the FBI with a photograph directory of the entire family hierarchy. He talked openly and at length inside a room he believed was private, but was actually wired. And he confirmed every serious crime he had committed in his own voice on recordings that were then played to juries. The Godfather's Corleone would never have done any of it. The fiction also presents loyalty as the bedrock of the organization. In reality, the person closest to Gotti, the man who had sat in the car beside him on December 16, 1985, and watched Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti fall outside Sparks Steakhouse, testified against him for 9 days straight in open court. Gravano went to the FBI because Gotti had talked about having him set up to take the blame for multiple acts of taking lives. The loyalty ran exactly as far as self-interest, and when Gotti's self-interest required sacrificing his own underboss, he did it on tape, without hesitation. FBI agent J. Bruce Mao, who led the investigation that finally brought Gotti down, told the New York Times directly he was obsessed with his own importance. He was convinced that no jury would ever convict him because he was John Gotti, a Caesar, an emperor. That quote explains both the rise and the fall in a single sentence. The arrogance that made Gotti a public figure was the same arrogance that made him hold meetings in rooms he believed were untouchable, demand public displays of loyalty that gave the FBI a roadmap of his organization, and speak on recorded tape about authorizing acts he then expected to walk away from in court. The real consequences of what Gotti built were also nothing like the film. The Godfather ends with Michael Corleone having consolidated power, with the family secure and the business intact. Gotti's story ended with him in a 6-by-8-foot cell in Marion, Illinois, allowed 1 hour outside it per day, dying of throat cancer at 61 years old. The Gambino family, which had 23 active crews, roughly 300 made members, more than 2,000 associates, and an estimated annual income of $500 million when he took over in 1986, was in collapse by the time he died in 2002. Half its made members were behind bars. His son had pleaded guilty to racketeering. His brother had been convicted and sentenced to 25 years. The other 4 New York families sent no representatives to his funeral. Anthony Casso, the former underboss of the Lucchese family, stated it simply: "What John Gotti did was the beginning of the end of Cosa Nostra. After Gotti's conviction in 1992, the bosses of other families became far more reluctant to step into the kind of public leadership he had inhabited. They had watched what happened when a boss made himself the most recognizable face in organized crime in America. Senior mafia leadership became deliberately invisible. The era of the Dapper Don was over. In the years that followed, the FBI and federal prosecutors, using the RICO Act as their primary tool, continued dismantling the five families one indictment at a time. By the early 2000s, the organizations that had controlled labor unions, construction contracts, the waterfront, the garment district, garbage collection, and gambling operations across New York City for decades had been reduced to shadows of what they had been. The real John Gotti story is worse than The Godfather, in the most fundamental sense. Not more dramatic, not more violent, but worse in outcome for everyone involved. A boss who removed his predecessor without authorization, broke every operational rule that had protected the organization for decades, talked himself onto federal recordings that left no defense for any jury, then turned his own family over to the law enforcement agencies he had spent his whole life outrunning. And the man he trusted most, his closest ally, the one who had helped plan and execute the Castellano removal, the one he had elevated from street-level soldier all the way to underboss of the most powerful organized crime family in the country, sat 9 days on a witness stand and told 12 anonymous jurors everything. The fiction had honor. The loyalty was real on screen. The code meant something. The reality had John Gotti in a khaki prison uniform in a cell barely big enough to lie down in, trying to relay orders to a son who had already decided to plead guilty and walk away. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.